A group of economic and financial leaders out with a letter to Fed Chief Ben Bernanke urging him to stop the $600 billion in asset purchases. Economist David Malpass is part of this. He's president of Encima Global, chairman of GrowPack, which sponsored the letter. Kevin Ferry basically says you guys have no idea what the Fed's doing anyway, so why are you weighing in, David? He said that earlier. He's a trader. I get these guys, you know what they're like, but do you actually know the mechanics of what the Fed is doing, or are you just shooting from the hip?
Hi, good morning, Joe, and good morning, Kevin. I think I know what they're doing, and It's not working. They already did one big round of quantitative easing last year, and it didn't help on employment. We have a huge unemployment, and there's not credit going to small businesses. And to have the Fed buy just government assets, all they're doing is making it easier for the government to spend money. It's not changing the dynamics of the debate at all, and it's hurting the dollar, so capital's going abroad. This is just not a workable strategy, and there's a huge group of economists that agree with that. Very few people out supporting the Fed on this. Around the world, the central banks and other governments know that this is really hurting the United States. They want the United States to be growing, and they don't think this is the approach that should be taken.
We don't want to necessarily, we've seen what their policies, where it's gotten a lot of these countries, Dave. They should not be, throwing stones, probably.
Well, China is throwing a lot of stones, and they're creating.
But what about the counterfactual? Once again, we're told that without QE1, or especially without the stimulus, that we'd be at 15, 16% unemployment, is what we hear. You can't prove one or the other. How do you know it didn't work?
We don't know that. And so the issue right now is, should the Fed be borrowing $600 billion from banks that might otherwise lend to small businesses, and dump it into the federal government? It doesn't make sense. It's not necessary. And it diverts attention from what should be going on, which is the government getting its act in order. And the effects on the markets are clear. The dollar's been weakening, and gold goes to new records. So it's really a harmful combination. And it's easy enough for them to just wind it down. They said in their statement, the FOMC statement originally, that they'd reconsider this as they go along. That's what we're asking. Reconsider and wind it down.
David, Andrew Sorkin here. We were talking about your letter before you came on the broadcast, and one of the issues that came up was this idea of, can you really pressure the Fed from a political standpoint? Meaning, are they gonna make a decision based on a letter like this and the politics, or ultimately are they going to make a decision based on what the bond market does? And what does your letter do to rile up the bond market itself?
I don't think the bond market actually does pressure the Fed. They kind of like it when the Fed is buying bonds. So the bond market ends up being a cheerleader. So I think what my hope is that the Fed looks at the economics and figures out that they're not really achieving what their goal is. Their goal is supposed to be getting us toward fuller employment. That means more credit for small businesses. That means a more confident business environment. But the opposite is happening. Look at the world is appalled at the quantitative easing, and everybody's trying to get their money out of the United States.
Yeah, but isn't that what a bond market vigilante looks like? It's not necessarily somebody who's on the floor writing these orders. It's whether or not the buyers show up when you try and unload the treasuries on them. Isn't that something that could put an intense amount of pressure on the Fed?
Kevin Ferry and I are old enough to remember bond market vigilantes were from the 70s, but what we saw very oddly in the 2000s was there were no bond market vigilantes. Remember, Alan Greenspan pumped up the whole world year after year, and still the bond market vigilantes didn't wake up to what was going on. The only vigilantes, I think, are currency vigilantes, commodity vigilantes, and they're ringing the fire bell right now. Get out of the theater.
Well, I hate to bring this up or I'll sound like an apologist, but the fact is that the Fed did a very good job at recapitalizing the banks and setting the structure to come out of a big problem with the first widespread quantitative easing.
This has nothing to do with
facilities. Right. So now you're into a different phase. And I would agree with you to the extent that if it only creates excess reserves, then it's pretty much doing nothing. But it also has very little actual downside risk effects if it only creates excess reserves.
Okay.
It's like a big toxic waste dump of nothing. And so, so I think from a risk management standpoint, the Fed finds himself probably in a better position than the critics. And again, I'm not a fan of doing this, don't get me wrong, but I think that once they've deliberated and decided to go this way, you have to realize that the potential benefit still exists. And what I hear is universal acceptance that there is no potential benefit. And I don't believe that to be the case. Remember, dollar-euro was $1.52 last Thanksgiving. It's $1.36. So the whole concept of the dollar getting beat up, it's against emerging countries. It's not against Europe.
Right, but
three countries are ready to leave the EU, but it's still $1.37. It was $1.19 too, but without QE2,
So it would do very well. I mean, look at rates. Even if you took them out of it,
right.
The 5-year note and the 10-year note against Germany are quite close.
Last comment.
Kevin's defense on this was that it probably won't do too much damage. There aren't benefits, but it probably won't do too much damage. Well, it does a huge amount of damage to have the Fed going into this uncharted territory where they've only been once before in the emergency of 2009 that they've actually bought assets. They bought MBS. But throughout its history before that, they didn't do this. And they're going into this new area of monetary policy where there's a lot of opposition and there aren't benefits to it. So it causes the risk of inflation, of dollar debasement, and it doesn't get credit to small businesses.
They might not look at that as a risk of dollar debasement or a risk of inflation. They might look at that as a goal, because you look at 20 years of what happened in Japan with no inflation. They give anything for just an inkling of inflation. And there are other people that think that you look at where all these trade imbalances are, and a weaker dollar would not be the worst thing in the world. I sometimes wonder whether, since Geithner has to keep looking with a straight face saying we'd never, ever debase the dollar, they like having that cover that the Fed can do it for them.
But isn't that a deeply embarrassing position for the United States to be in, where our officials are saying we have a strong dollar policy, and it happens for 10 years in a row when the dollar goes down a lot, and we still have officials. Even last week, President Obama was having to make this incredible statement that the Fed's actions don't affect the dollar. Which doesn't make any sense to anybody in the world, and yet that's the official position of the United States, because we've said it so long, we've forgotten any logic. The simple message is the Fed should seriously reconsider this and discontinue the policy of buying long-term assets. It's very risky, because they're funding them overnight. They're using overnight funding to buy 5-year assets. Everybody. So Kevin's saying these people don't know what they're talking about. Everybody knows not to do that.
He's getting an eighth every time they buy one. He doesn't really care. He thinks it's pretty good.
Remember, the Fed's paying commission on all these bonds they're buying, which is crazy.
It only makes the street stronger. I'm not an apologist for it, but I would say that,
you are.
You should feel his suit. It is the finest attack. I mean, where'd you get that? Is like it was like silk or something. Yeah. All right. Thank you, David Malpass. I mean, he is flush.
Got some new has the letter.
Got some new contacts. Got a new haircut. I mean, he's flush. An eighth on every one of 600 billion. That adds up, doesn't it?
They want you to play along.